let's start with our very first guest of the evening, and that is going to be, let me pull up her image. That is going to be our friend Erica Cantley of Teaching Hamlet as My Father Died, and I will invite Erica to join us here. Let me close this image first. Let me close that out so I can invite Erica to join us. And let's see if Erica is still there. Here she is. Okay. No. Go live with Erica Cantley. Okay, so we'll ask Erica, and she is the author of the book Teaching. Erica.
Hi, Rodney.
Hi, how are you?
So great. I'm thrilled to be here.
I'm thrilled to have you. This is your book, Teaching Hamlet as My Father Died, and you were so kind as not only to send me this book, but to give me a personal inscription on that book, so I'm very grateful for that. I've been checking this book out. It's a really fantastic book. And Erica, before I get started into the book itself, why don't we tell the people out there who are joining us, either just joining the program or have been with us for this first 20 minutes or so, about yourself and who you are. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I was a high school English teacher in Pennsylvania for 16 years. But before that, I had a full career as a maitre d' and restaurant manager here in New York and Boston. So I guess that's the short version of
That's
who
the
I am.
short version. And I want to ask you, you graduated from initially from Columbia University, right? Under the tutelage of James Shapiro.
I was so lucky. I didn't even know at the time how incredibly fortunate I was to study with James Shapiro. I knew that he was a great teacher, and I had my Shakespeare moment, as they say, in his class. But of course, as time went by, I mean, that was about 2000, I think. So as time went by, he published more and more books, and of course, continues to be one of the most inspiring and knowledgeable scholars of the day. And first and foremost, just an amazing teacher, just an
Yeah.
amazing, powerful, passionate teacher that sparked my love for Shakespeare. So.
Okay. So you studied with him, and Melissa, our friend Melissa Bell, said she couldn't get into his class. So you were fortunate enough to study with James Shapiro.
I was very lucky, I'm telling you. I had a good advisor.
So you did your studies at Columbia with James Shapiro, and then you went on to some further studies. Where did you do your MA?
At Arcadia University in Philadelphia.
Okay, all right. So then from there, after all those studies with English, and I'm sure you spent a lot of time with Shakespeare during that time, how did the road take you to culinary arts instead of into teaching?
Right. Okay. Well, actually, what happened was first I went to restaurant management culinary school. So
Okay.
out of a year after high school. Basically, I went to high school, then I went to a year of junior college, and I kind of got all A's and F's, and I wasn't, focused. And it was
Okay.
back when they would say, well, what do you like to do? What are you good at? And I said, well, I like to cook and give dinner parties. So then my mom said, well, what about the restaurant school? And I'm from Philadelphia, so the restaurant school in Philadelphia. I didn't, I was so ignorant. I didn't even know you could go to school to work in a restaurant. I mean, of course, now everyone knows that, but back then they didn't. So that was how I launched in. And
Mm-hmm.
I ended up having a wonderful, very fun and satisfying career that I did for at least 10 years. And I had never seen myself as somebody who wouldn't have that classic liberal arts education, but it just hadn't happened yet. So I
Mm-hmm.
actually started at Columbia when I was 29.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was the very different track. So I came to teaching really after I finished the undergrad. Then through that process, there were a couple of seminal moments during my time at Columbia that kind of showed me I really want to teach.
Mm-hmm.
And so then when I graduated, I left New York and I went to Pennsylvania and started teaching at my high school alma mater.
Okay.
So
That's a
that's the
nice way
way
to
it
go.
worked. And then I got my master's while I was teaching.
Okay. All right.
So
So, I'm sorry.
a little bit of an untraditional path.
Well, we all follow our own unique path, and then from there, so you were doing high school teaching, and then you were there for that was the majority of your career. There, are you still teaching or no?
No, I'm doing some side things, but I stepped away from the classroom a couple years ago in part to finish the book and also because there were a lot of things going on in my life that, just
Hmm. All right.
precipitated that move. But I haven't left teaching forever. But,
Mhm.
you know,
Okay, so you stepped away, and at some point along the way, when you were teaching, the story that unfolds in your book started to happen, and your father, unfortunately, he was dealing with cancer, and he was approaching his final days, and you detail that in a beautiful way, it's a heart-wrenching way in your book about the process of teaching your class about Hamlet. Well, you're teaching an English class, but you happen to have one big chunk of it that is focused on Shakespeare, and in that Shakespeare section, you're focusing on Hamlet specifically. And it's very interesting how that what's happening with your instruction of Hamlet dovetails with what's happening with your father's situation. As I'm reading the book, it's really for me exciting to see how you incorporate bits of the Shakespeare text into the story of what's happening with your father. Like you'll have to be or not to be, and you're explaining that to your students, but it reveals something about your relationship with what's happening with your experience of watching what's happening with your father. How long did this was the time span of writing this book as opposed to the actual time span of what you're chronicling?
it took me 5 years.
5 years
5 years.
to write the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. But this is a 3 month period of time that this is all happening
Correct.
in. Okay.
Correct.
So, and how many years ago was this taking place?
My father died in 14.
In
And
2014.
yeah, and what happened was that, when you're a teacher or certainly you're working in a theater and you've got it's all about the calendar, right? And what's coming up this season. And so when we got the news that there was nothing more that they could do for my father and that, his death was imminent, I kind of started to look at my calendar and I said, wow, I'm going to be teaching Hamlet when my father dies. That's pretty intense. And it was already my favorite time of the year, my favorite thing to teach, amongst many things that I was very lucky to teach. Um, so I said, well, that's a good title, and I had already been kind of obsessed with death and with everything that um, is dealt with in Hamlet and in so many of the books that I taught. And so I was kind of primed to know that this was going to be apt material to be dealing with as my dad was dying. But it really blew me away the degree to which I kept seeing things I had never seen before in the play. Or it just hit me. It's like, yeah, I've read that line before. My gorge rises at it. I knew what it meant, but I didn't physically feel it
Right.
until I had a dead dad.
Mm-hmm.
So I was taking notes all along in my lesson plan. And things like that, because I definitely had the idea. I always wanted to write about my father because he was such a wonderful man and we had such a special relationship. So that first, when it was happening, I basically just took notes, and I did a lot of journaling when I was visiting my dad for the last time. And then the following year, I started really writing on the book as my culminating project for my master's.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I must have finished that at least 7 times. over 5 years.
Wow.
Just
Wow.
rewrite and rewrite, and talk about the many parallels that I found. One of them was that um, it just took me so long to finish the job,
Right.
like Hamlet, and it looked
Like
like I
Hamlet.
was delaying. Um, in retrospect, I realized it was just extremely difficult material to return to every time that it needed to be
Hmm.
revised, and just like any tragedy that you teach, my dad always dies at the end. So
Unfortunately, but
yeah,
it's so interesting the way you make those connections. Early on, I think maybe even in the first or second chapter, you talk about how Hamlet didn't know his father was going to die when he went away to school, but you knew the end was coming, and your father wasn't close by. Your father was in Costa Rica, if I remember
yeah,
correctly.
yeah.
So it wasn't even just that you can go drive from New York to Philadelphia and go see him or something. He was quite a ways away, and I think it all culminated with that one trip over where you finally went over and were there when in his final days. Right. So and there were a lot of other places where you were mentioning how a line will jump out to you that you didn't see the significance of before in relation to your own story. There were so many lines that you inserted like that into your book, like about uh, this father had a father and he had a father before him, and things like that, where it's very personal a connection to you, but it's so universal to the Hamlet story and to all of us. I connected to it myself in this past year. My father passed, so it had a lot of resonance for me. And much like your what you did with your book, in many ways I have seen some of those echoes in my own relationship. So for me, it's um, almost what's the word I'm looking for? I'm losing the word. It's something that usually is associated with Greek tragedy, but it's something that cathartic. It's a
Cathartic.
catharsis, right? It's very cathartic for me reading your book because it feels like there's something that I experienced myself that it's helping me kind of move through. So
That's
you took
beautiful. Thank
it
you.
took several years for you. It took 5 years for you to write it. At what point during your journey that you're writing and rewriting and journaling, at what point do you choose a specific publisher for it and shop it to the publisher? Or is that something that you kind of had set in early on?
Well, this is an excellent question, and it was early on. I had the concept, and I had the initial manuscript from grad school, and I approached a woman who I had remembered from when I lived here in New York before. Her name is Beth Wareham, and she is a brilliant editor, and she was working as a personal editor. So she agreed to take me on, and so I hired her, and we worked through it, and I don't think she thought it was going to take as long as it did, but she was absolutely instrumental in helping me shape the final product. And she has an independent publishing company with Lisa Hagen. So
Mm-hmm.
Lisa Hagen became my agent, and the three of us were convinced that this was going to be appealing to major publishers, and that we could publish it traditionally. That it had plenty of elements that would be of interest, and so when it was finished and ready to be shopped around, after a while, I ended up with kind of a handful of very encouraging rejection letters, and this sense that there was a glut in the memoir market.
Mm-hmm.
And I just, you have ideas about, I always wanted to write, and I always had an idea of what that first book was going to look like. And, uh, at a certain point, I said, well, I don't want to wait any longer. Let's get this out there, and then do stuff with it and just see what happens. So
Mm-hmm.
then that was when I decided, hey, why not have Lisa Hagen Publishing Lisa Hagen Books published the book, and it worked out perfectly, honestly, because these two women were my champions all along, and they loved the book and they were highly invested in it. So that's how it went. But it was a roller coaster ride. I mean, that first week it was so strange because when she sent out the first round of pitches to major publishers, she sent them out, I think, on April 22nd, but on April 23rd, which is Shakespeare's birth and death date, supposedly, we got three major publishers that said, yes, I'd like to take a look at the book. So
Wow.
that was so thrilling.
That's huge.
This is going to happen. And then by that was, I think, a Tuesday or something. And by the end of the week, they said, this is really nice. And I'm sure she'll find a home somewhere. But
well, I'm very glad it found a home where it did, because it's a wonderful book. And now that it's out, are there plans for where it's going to go next? Is it going to be released in a different edition, or is it going to be online? Is it for a Kindle, things like that?
It is Kindle now. I think it'll be a audiobook at some point. I don't know when. Of course, the whole pandemic has affected how this stuff happens and gets promoted. So I'm not really sure about that. But thanks to wonderful people like yourself, Rodney, that are telling people about it and reading it. I feel very grateful, because so much of our life is kind of in a vacuum right now. So.
Well, I mean, it's this for the situation right now. If someone is looking for a book to read, really, it's one of the most one of the books that really grabbed me the most that I've read in recent years. So I highly recommend it. Teaching Hamlet as My Father Died. Erica, I thank you so much for sharing your book with us, for joining us tonight, and I encourage everyone to get it. Hopefully we'll be in touch again in the future, and we'll have you join us for another event at some point soon down the road.
I would love that, and I just want to say I appreciate you so much. I've been learning so much from New York Shakespeare about all these wonderful people doing great Shakespeare stuff. So thank you.
I'm very happy you're part of that conversation as well. Thank you very much, Erica. Have a good night.
Bye.
All right, so that was Erica Cantley of Teaching Hamlet as My Father Died. You can find that on Amazon and on anywhere else where books are sold. You can look up Erica's profile on social media, and you can find all the links for that information. So that was Erica Cantley. I'm sorry. We will go to our next guest of the evening, and that